Hello everyone. I'm coming to you today trapped from inside of a Windows XP computer. Isn't that cool? All right, today we're going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of sources you can find in sports reporting. And namely, we're going to talk about this in terms of what you should be looking for out of your sports features. So I'm going to emphasize some of the more feature-heavy stuff in today's presentation because that will help you out as you work on that assignment. So finding and establishing connections with sources is one of the more valuable things you can do in sports reporting. It's important in all kinds of journalism, but it's especially important in sports journalism because it's such a small world. There's a good chance that if you work in sports reporting for any given period of time, you're going to be put on some sort of beat. Whether it is working for a wire service or whether it's working for a local news organization, local television, it doesn't matter. Beats tend to go along with sports coverage. Now, even though we weren't doing and still aren't really doing beat coverage in this class because I wanted to make sure that you all have a diverse array of sports that you cover, I do want to talk about the nature of beats and how those sources connect to them. Sometimes your beat in sports could be a particular sport, not tied to any geographical area or to any level of competition. So it could just be that you're a really good track and field reporter. You are super well versed in the rules of track and field. You know indoor and outdoor track and field. You know who the coaches are. You know who the athletes are. You know what big schools tend to produce the best athletes in track and field. You know the path to go from being really good in college to getting to the Olympics. So it could be that is what you cover. There's a particular sport that you are very good at, and so you are just the person who covers that particular sport. It could also be team-centric. So maybe it is that you're a really good basketball reporter and you work your way up and now you cover the Atlanta Hawks. You could be the beat reporter that only covers the Atlanta Hawks. And so in that case, the level of reporting that's expected out of you is much deeper. So the sports reporters who are on beats that only cover one team, if you look at the kind of work they're doing covering that team, it is traveling everywhere the team goes. It is having deep analysis and deep interviews with coaches and assistants and players. It is covering that team from top to bottom as thoroughly as you possibly can. But more realistically, though, there's actually kind of the beats that you are all covering in this class, which are more regional beats. Regional beats in sports have become popular because there are fewer reporters now than there used to be. And so sports reporters are expected to do more. And as a part of that, they're expected to cover more stuff. So someone who is a beat reporter for Fox Sports, for example, may find themselves covering the Miami Heat and the Florida Panthers and the Miami Marlins. They cover all three sports, but because it is geographically based, what you're actually covering is South Florida. You're covering Miami and the surrounding area. And so if you think about the kinds of reporting you've been doing in this class up to this point, it's essentially been Georgia Southern / sort of coastal Georgia beat coverage. You've been covering Georgia Southern sports or other local high school athletics as well. So we've kind of been mimicking this kind of beat coverage throughout the semester. Now, it's important to note that in every situation, if you are going to be a sports reporter and that is your life goal and that is the thing that you want more than anything is to work in sports journalism, when you are covering sports and you come across other sports reporters, you come across people who you think might also be sources for you, coaches, assistants, players, anybody you think might be useful in a story, get their contact information, give them your contact information, make sure that you are familiar to them so that when you pop up and you're like, hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm working for this place, and I would like to interview you for a story, you're not a stranger to them. Sports is a really small world, and the more we can make that small world work in our advantage, the better. Also, get business cards. If you're going to work in sports reporting, make sure you get some business cards because you'll want to make those connections. Okay, let's talk now about the different kinds of sources that we can get in sports reporting and what kind of shape they tend to take. First, I'm going to take a sip of Diet Coke first. Much better. Okay, there are different levels of source. This is a common thing in news reporting in general, but in sports reporting, The way that these sources come together is going to be a little bit different based on job title, which we will discuss. So first of all, you've got your primary sources. These are your main people. If we use a hot dog as a metaphor, then the actual hot dog itself is your primary source. That metaphor will make more sense in a little bit. So these are your main people. These are the ones you are directly writing about. These are your, oftentimes, if we think about the shape that these folks take in sports, it's going to be your coaches or your players. It also can depend entirely on what you are writing about. So let's say that a team is in the process of hiring a new coach. That coach's agent is going to be the public relations point person for them, which means that the point person is going to kind of end up being the primary source in this situation. But either way, they're the main people you're writing about, whether it's a game coverage story or whether it's an analysis story or whether it's a feature story. It's the person that is the most important that you are writing about at this given moment. Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk about our other kinds of sources. We've also got our secondary sources. If the primary sources are the hot dog, then the secondary sources are the condiments. They're the ketchup and mustard, the relish. They're the things you put on that add flavor and flair and color to the story. Even if they're not directly involved, they're the folks who can give a sense of attention. And this is especially important in feature stories. So let's say you're writing a feature story about someone who just won a very prestigious award, for example, in sports, right? Who else would you want to talk to other than the player who won the award? Who else in their circle of things is going to be able to talk about their athletic ability and what they mean to the team and how hard they've trained and all of that stuff? So it could be your coaches, the coaches of that particular player. It could be their teammates. It could be their personal friends and maybe trainers. It could be their family. It could be rivals that they've had in the sport itself. One of the things you've noticed is, although it feels like it was really old history now, when Kobe Bryant died earlier in the year, the kinds of people who the news and sports world were talking to a lot after that, they were folks who were at some point involved in Kobe Bryant's life, either as coaches or teammates or as rivals. They were people who had gotten to know him. And so these are incredibly important for feature stories. And as you put your feature stories together, I am looking for you to have a solid level of not just information from your primary source, the main person you're interviewing, but also those secondary sources who can tell you about that main source without actually being them. Okay, let's move on. Material sources. These are the non-humans. These are databases, numbers, statistics, records, historical stuff. We're going to spend a whole lecture just talking about how to effectively use numbers in both regular recap stories and in feature stories. But just so you know, what we're talking about with material sources are statistics, stuff like game-based statistics. So in one specific game, how did they perform? But it could also be something like pulled from a media guide, how they performed in one full season. So a full season's worth of metrics. And if you don't have access to media guides, or if you are looking for information from back before media guides were really prevalent, I have linked to the Folio site, the main link to sports-reference.com. They have, for pretty much every sport you could imagine, an enormous amount of data on past athletes and teams and statistics just there for the taking. So it is a great resource for you to use. Okay, material sources are just statistics and data. What are other kinds of people that we can count on as sources? Well, there's your behind the scenes sources. So what in the world is a behind the scenes source? A behind the scenes source these are folks who provide pertinent information or ideas for a story, but are not necessarily used in the actual story itself. So they're going to give you good information, but you're not going to quote them in the story. You're not going to have a direct quote from them that says so-and-so said, but the information that they give you could point you in the right direction for what could be a really good story or a good angle for a feature or something like that. So effectively, we can think of these kind of sources as tipsters, or the kinds of people who tip reporters off to pay attention to certain aspects. And, you know, we tend to think about these folks from a stereotypical point of view, I think because of Watergate, as being like people smoking cigarettes and hanging out in parking garages in Washington, D.C. But if we think about them in terms of actual sports coverage, a lot of the times it's going to be team trainers. It could be in college sports, student managers. It could be roommates or people close to a player who can tip you off and say that, hey, the coach and this player are going at each other and are sort of not liking each other. Their chemistry isn't meshing. It could be that the player's roommate is saying like they are concerned that they have seen more drugs involved in their life lately, something like that. It could be a pretty heavy topic. So you're not oftentimes going to take this stuff and just put it in a story. What you're going to do is take it and verify it. If you get information from a tipster, from a behind-the-scenes source, you're going to try to verify it with that primary source, or you're going to try to find those secondary sources who will verify the thing that a behind-the-scenes source is telling you. Also, by the way, just to be careful, this in sports reporting happens a lot, is people trying to say off the record. Off the record is a thing that has to be agreed upon by both parties. If a source says, hey, I want to tell you something behind the scenes, I want to tell it to you on the or off the record, what I am saying as a source is what I want you to do is listen to what I'm saying, but I don't want to be a part of the story. But you as the reporter have the power to agree or disagree to put them off the record. So if someone just comes up to you and says, hey, this is off the record, if the information you think they're going to tell you is something you need for a story, you should stop them and say, hey, no. I don't want anything off the record in this story. I want everything to be on the record. And therefore, if anything you tell me, I'm going to put in a story. Like, just off the record is something that must be agreed upon by both the source and the reporter. Also, it is in journalism across the board, sports or otherwise, it is a breach of etiquette to give up a source. So never share the source of deep background information with anyone except your editor. So the person who is in charge of you, where you're writing, you can tell them who the source is, but don't tell other people, especially not your primary sources, the people who you are going to use to verify the information that the behind the scenes source is telling you. Hey, maybe don't tell them exactly who told you. And then we have anonymous sources. This is when you convince a behind-the-scenes source to allow themselves to be quoted in a story without their name. Or this is the good side of it, right? If somebody is a behind-the-scenes source and you can convince them to be an on-the-record source, that's wonderful. You can tell them, hey, I can keep you anonymous in this story, but I want to go with what you said. Great. If it's the other way around and a source comes to you and says, hey, I want to tell you this stuff and I want you to publish it, but I don't want my name attached to it. I want to be anonymous. That should raise some flags. That should raise some red flags for you about why what would be motivating them to tell you this information and get you to publish it. Is it that they want to hurt the person that they are telling you information about? Is it that they want to get in the way of something that they don't like happening? Just make sure you're stopping for a second to question the motivation of people who are coming to you and volunteering information and are saying that they're okay publishing it or with you publishing it, but they don't want their name attached to it. That's not good. Also, in general, just across the board, research has shown that the audience that you're writing for, they tend to trust stories with anonymous sources way less than with named sources, or even no sources. Like, anonymous sources in stories actually come across as worse as when you just don't have any sources at all. So before you ever publish an anonymous source, you should ask yourself some questions. What is the news value? So how important is it that people know about this? Who are the other sources? So who else could I use to verify this information? And is there a way it could be verified other than publishing information from an anonymous source? How dependable is this anonymous source? Have they burned you in the past? Or have they been reliable in the past? And is there absolutely not a single other human being on earth who will go on the record with this info? What I mean by that is, can you not convince somebody else to say it and agree to say it on the record? You should always try to get your sources on the record and get your sources named. And last but not least, we have our citizen journalist sources, which are an increasingly important part of sports reporting in the modern age. These are regular people who care a lot about a sport. A lot of them are super fans. They're people who are paying very close attention to a certain team or a certain sport, and increasingly have spaces online where they can talk about things that they are discovering. Twitter is kind of the main and most obvious source, and there are tons of examples of sports stories that have been launched because of something somebody said on Twitter. But I want to focus on something that's not Twitter as an example, and that is Reddit. And there's two examples I've linked to the folio section of this class with the video lectures that I want you to take a look at. One of which involves Florida State. Someone just on Reddit, on the college football subreddit, discovering that Florida State was not actually bowl eligible one year when they were given a bowl game, or they were invited to a bowl game, because of the way that the NCAA rules work with lower ranked teams. And then another one that involves essentially the discovery of two fake teams in college football that were giving other teams wins. Both of these are wild stories, and they both came from what are essentially journalistic acts done by non-professional journalists. And this is where you as a sports reporter come into play. If you're going to be a professional sports reporter, your job is to take this stuff that people are posting online and try to verify it. And in this case, I actually found not just the Reddit post, but the follow-up by Sports Illustrated, who put reporters on the story and verified this info and determined that that year, Florida State was not actually bowl eligible. Even though they did play in a bowl game that year, the NCAA made an exception for them. But the professional reporters verified what the Reddit sleuths had been able to find just by digging around. Now, in a perfect world, it would be the professional sports reporters who are the ones finding this stuff. But in the world that we're in now, there's so many people who are talking about sports online that what our role can be as professional sports reporters is the folks who can vet and verify that information. Also, I just really liked using this as an example because I dislike Florida State. So with that, we are pretty well done with our conversation on the different kinds of sources we can get. So let's do the stop share. So with that, we are going to just remind you to please make sure you're taking the quizzes that involve the rules of sports. Make sure you're keeping on track of those. And also take a look at the practice assignments that have been posted. Namely, I would like you to make sure you understand the rules of the inaugural MMJ4332 sports journalism draft picking competition, and extra credit points will go to the people who are the first, second, and third most accurate. Also, next week, we're going to do a special practice assignment with headlines, but more on that later. So for now, make sure you are washing your hands, and I will see y'all later.